On behalf of the SED, I'd like to welcome you guys to the amazing city. Stanley Cup champions, too. St. Louis. Now, I'm not Laura, but I was asked to introduce Laura before her plenary lecture. Now, Laura Veldkamp is a professor of finance at Columbia University's Graduate School of Business and a co-editor of the journal Economic Theory. And before Columbia, she was at NYU Stern for 15 years, and my colleague for 8 of them. Now, in preparing to introduce Laura, I spent some time researching. I mean, that's what we do, right? So I went to her website, and then started scrolling. And then my first thought, it wasn't a surprise, but this was my first thought. I was like, she's a machine. I scroll down, I was like, I keep scrolling and scrolling. And I was actually joking with Isaac. I was like, to find my paper with Isaac, I had to scroll all the way down to the very, very bottom, and then there was our paper. But when you kind of look at the research and just, I mean, again, it wasn't a surprise to me, but I think there's a very clear story to tell when you look at her webpage, is that as you look through those papers, there's an amazingly broad array of topics that she's engaged in. And, I kind of have a list of things that it spans. It's like business cycles, economic growth, financial markets, portfolio choice, female labor force participation, international trade stuff, and then even, I think this is a spectacular paper, this paper with Patrick Bolton and Marcus Brunemeyer on leadership and corporate culture. And then when you kind of think about that research portfolio, it really does speak to, how genuinely curious she is about economics. And I saw this all the time at NYU when someone would come through. She was the first person to ask them about their work. She would always ask them a bunch of questions, and then she'd kind of wind up and throw them the fastball. And it could always, by the end there, I could always see it coming, and that's why I'd start to hide. And but despite all these different topics, there's a core theme in this research. You'd have to be oblivious not to see this. And at any model that she writes down is some setting where you have consumers, investors, firms, what have you. They're grappling with incomplete information, and they face some choices about the information they need to acquire or how they're going to use it. And this is actually amazingly summarized in a book she wrote right when I showed up at NYU called Information Choice in Macroeconomics and Finance. So I'm just going to say a couple more things, though. So when I looked through the book, and this is a true story, there's a chapter in there that's amazingly fascinating. It's at the back, and it's called Returns to Scale to Information. And it comes up with this, in the intro of that chapter, it's a really simple idea. And I still think about this today, is this idea that information, what is it? Well, it's a lot like ideas, how we typically think about them in growth theory. It has non-rival elements and often face large fixed costs to acquire. And then it gives rise to these interesting insights about gains to specialization. And coming from this from trade or economic growth, like myself, I found it completely fascinating. Now this chapter, I think, is even more relevant today. And in fact, that's what Laura's going to be talking about right now. So with big data and all the technological changes that we're seeing around it, I don't think there's anyone more suited to ask and answer questions about big data and how it relates to the macroeconomy. So please join me in welcoming Laura Veldkamp.
All right, here we go. Data in the aggregate economy. I'm delighted, I'm honored to be here with all of you today. Let's see what we can learn. So data is any information that can be encoded as a binary sequence of zeros and ones. Okay, that's incredibly broad. It includes things like music, poetry, patents. I am not here to talk about any of that stuff today. That is not my forte. What I am here to talk about is a subset of data, which is statistics and records of transactions. So why am I interested in that subset of data? Because that's what the big data revolution, machine learning, artificial intelligence, That's what these algorithms are about. They're taking that kind of data and using it for predictions. So why is everybody talking about data and big data right now? Because there have been remarkable technological breakthroughs, and we're entering a new era. Big data is the industrialization of knowledge production. So why do I say that? Well, think before the industrialization era, we had lots of goods production. If you wanted a cup, say, a tinsmith would take some tin and bang out a cup for you. And if you wanted a little bigger or a little wider, he'd make it however you wanted it. And if somebody came along and dumped a ton of tin on the tinsmith's front yard, it would take the tinsmith a long time to work through all that tin. Well, we're now in the era of, we're leaving the era of artisanal knowledge production. When you want to have a model, you want to make a prediction, you build a model for a purpose to answer the particular questions at hand based on the exact data you have. And if you get some different data, you got to sit down and rejig your model and think about how to incorporate that new piece of data, and requires a lot of labor. So industrialization comes along, and now we can take that big chunk of tin and work through it through the factory very quickly, and industrialization has mitigated the diminishing returns to scale. It didn't eliminate it, but it made it less severe. Similarly, big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, if you dump 5,000 variables on an economist, these technologies hold the promise that we'll be able to feed those 5,000 variables through an algorithm and get a useful prediction. And if you give me 5,001, I'll enter one new series, hit run, and get a new prediction that makes use of that additional data. So it's mitigating the diminishing returns to data. And so this is why, at this point, we're entering a discussion about, is data the new oil, and are we entering the new economy? And so when we transitioned from agrarian to industrial, we changed our production functions. Macroeconomists evolved. Instead of having land in our production function, we started talking about capital and workers and equilibrium wages. So we're going through a transformation again. What if production includes data? So that's the question I want to pose today. So my talk has 3 parts. The first, I want to tell you and raise questions about how data is affecting every corner of macroeconomics, and maybe what you work on as well. But it'll be a quick tour through many facts, and it'll raise more questions than answers. Second, I'll talk about a couple of tools we have to think about data, to start answering some of these questions. First, I'll talk about how data is similar to and different from technology or ideas. And second, I'll talk about relevant tools from the information frictions literature. And after I describe those tools, I'll sketch a framework that will help us explore the effect of data on aggregate economic activity. And this framework is not something that we've been thinking about for a decade that has all the twists and turns and whistles and bells. It's a sketch. It's a beginning to which I hope many of us will add different facets. Oops. There we go. Okay, so our quick tour through many topics. Let's start with GDP. It's at the core of macroeconomics. Measured data in GDP is large and growing. Information and communications technology, often abbreviated ICT, is 6.5% of global GDP and at least 100 million workers. But most data is not measured in GDP. Why? Because it's bartered. You probably have an app on your phone that you paid nothing for. It was free, yet somebody paid to develop it. Why would somebody pay to develop something that they're going to give away for free? Because when you downloaded that app, you did pay for it. You paid for it with your data. So you got a service, a digital service, in exchange for data at 0 price. That's a classic barter. And things at 0 price get 0 weight in GDP. So a lot of data right now is being bartered, and therefore it's not being captured by GDP. Another place that data enters classic economic questions, international economics. So there's this possibility that data, with its low transportation costs, almost 0 marginal cost of sending anywhere in the world, will negate geography. It's a possibility. So Rwandan President Paul Kagame talks about this, saying, "We are determined to take full advantage of the digital revolution. This revolution is summed up by the fact it is no longer of utmost importance where you are, but rather what you can do." Is that a possibility? Maybe. In a whole different realm, control of data is a significant issue right now in trade negotiations. The European Commission at this very moment is talking about how should we devise tariff policy with respect to data. And they're asking the question, are we exporting data assets at zero price to foreign entities. Why do I say we're exporting data at zero price? Because remember, lots of data is being bartered. So we're giving data away in exchange for services. Most tariff policy is based on the price of the good. If the good has zero price, how do we develop tariff policy with respect to that good or that service or that asset? Another place data raises questions, monetary policy or monetary economics. So the digital economy is changing how firms adjust prices. Gornichenko and Talavera estimate that price changes occur 4 to 5 times more frequently in online stores than in bricks and mortar stores. That's not surprising. They're algorithms. They can take in the demand and adjust automatically. You don't have to stick stickers on everything on the shelf. But this raises the question, might there be more price flexibility going forward? And might that price flexibility reduce monetary policy effectiveness? Again, I don't know the answer, but these are questions that data raises that we could answer. Data matters for labor markets. One of the questions we hear people asking all the time, will artificial intelligence displace labor? Will there be any workers in the future? Would be the extreme version of it. So Acemoglu and Restrepo took a first pass at that one. But there's yet another question for labor markets, which is, will machine learning reduce search frictions? It's not that outlandish that an employer a few years from now would take millions of CVs or cover letters or whatever information they can gather about potential workers, scan through them, and the machine will identify the best worker from that set with a very high confidence probability that that worker is going to be a good match and that this will take seconds. Worker hired, problem solved. Will we still have search frictions? And lastly, data changes firm dynamics. So IT makes firms more productive. That's not surprising. That's why they're investing in it, after all. But that's especially true for the largest firms. They benefit disproportionately from IT investments. So maybe part of what's making big firms a lot bigger is their ability to reap the gains of data. Data and finance also benefits large firms. My own work with Mariam Farboudi and Julian Beguenau argues that big data and finance lowers the cost of capital. Investors can harvest this data and use it to make better forecasts and reduce the risk of their investments, but that's especially true for the largest firms. So it's disproportionately benefiting them. So does this have something to do with the firm size distribution? And a related question, does data create market power? Could data potentially be a barrier to entry? Which, by the way, will be the subject of the plenary tomorrow. Not the data part, the market power part. Okay, so that's a lot of what ifs. There's a lot of inflated rhetoric, a lot of big promises of data. The manager in the cartoon is saying, and after big data solves all our problems, we'll ride away on magic flying unicorns. Okay, so a lot of this may sound pie in the sky. Let's bring it back down to earth and ask, what tools can we use to think sensibly about data and figure out what of this are hot air claims and what of this is measurably likely to be important. So one set of tools, growth theory. So why would we use growth theory to think about data? Those seem like totally different topics. Well, growth theory focuses a lot on the economics of ideas and technology, and data has a lot of important similarities with ideas and technology. Namely, it enhances productivity, it's non-rival. You can use CompuStat, I can use CompuStat, we can both happily run regressions without getting in each other's way. And third, it's got returns to scale. So you can apply a data set to a small firm and get a small benefit. You can apply the same data set to a big firm to improve its decision making and get bigger benefits. And the current thinking is, well, then this makes data just like ideas, right? And so we have a bunch of models, all of which I respect enormously, that are starting to think about data and growth and related issues of data ownership and privacy and so forth. So this is work by Jones and Tinetti, Agrawal, Liu, Aghion. But they're equating data with technology because it shares these similarities. Data can also be traded like ideas or patents, right? There's a lot of buying and selling of data that's going on right now. But there's a little bit of a difference. Technologies leak. So lots of authors have written about this. Easterly has some wonderful examples. But data is not embodied in human capital. So it's not going to leak quite as easily. What do I mean by that? Well, Easterly writes about these garment factories in Bangladesh, and somebody who worked there took the idea about how this place was organized and took to set up his own factory, right? But imagine that now he wants to take with him the knowledge of the client list, their addresses, their phone numbers, and their monthly orders. Try holding on to that for more than 10 clients in your head for a few days. Any medium-sized data set is not something we can remember. Now, you can steal it, you can take the USB drive and walk away from it, but that's a crime, and we have institutions that prevent that. Okay? So it's not, these aren't abstract ideas that diffuse in the same ways as technologies. Ideas from information frictions. So a lot of the information frictions literature, as Mike alluded to, has been talking about where does information come from? How do we come about it? How do we choose which information to see, and so forth? So one important idea that goes back to, well, my job market paper, work that I did with Stan, Guillermo Ordóñez's job market paper, work by Fajlbaum, Schall, and Taschereau Dumochel, all have the idea that data is a byproduct of economic activity. You produce something and you learn something. But if you didn't produce, you don't learn what would have happened if you had produced it. So you got to make something to learn something. And in these models, this something that you learned wasn't called data, it was called information or a signal or something, and it was largely about aggregate productivity. But I'm going to adapt this kind of framework to make that information, that data, good or firm specific. And these papers have an early version of what's often called the data feedback loop. When you've got more data, you make better decisions, you're more productive, but being more productive means you produce more, which generates more data and more output and so forth. Now, notice that unlike technology, this is quite a different production function. So technology we often think of as being produced by a worker and a lab. We have capital and labor, and we've got to invest. These are expensive, right? So we've got to create incentives for firms to create new ideas. But this data stuff, we don't have to give you an incentive to produce it. It's a byproduct. You just have to produce. Presumably, you already had an incentive to produce whatever goods you were producing, and you're just going to get the data as a byproduct. So we don't have to set up the same kinds of institutional structures to create incentives for data as we did for ideas in growth theory. Okay. Big data, these technologies, machine learning, AI, artificial intelligence, these are prediction technologies. They're not idea-generating technologies. They're not productivity-generating technologies. They are prediction technologies. And so incentives to acquire information for prediction is a topic that's been taken up in many literatures. So Grossman and Stiglitz and the many, many papers that have built on their setting thought about prediction of financial markets. Sims thinks about prediction in investment consumption when there are many variables to choose with which one might predict. My own work with Christian Hellwig thought about acquiring information in strategic games that's used to predict others' actions. But in all these different settings, we have tools to think about how to value and how to choose information that's used for predictions. So we'll draw on some of these tools. Now, when I say that, you may be asking yourself, I'm sort of using the words data and information and signal interchangeably. Is this just a change of vocabulary? Is she going to sell us old stuff with a new label on it and call it brand new? A little bit. All research draws on what came before it. But there's something important here. Talking about data, I think, is a really important step forward for the information frictions literature, not just learning about macroeconomics and valuing data. I think this is important for the information literature because there are three barriers that this literature faces for it to really break through and be mainstream. One, we face an information problem. We face a measurability problem. It's really tough to measure a signal. How good was it? Which ruler am I going to use to figure that out? Yeah, we have ways of inferring that indirectly, but it's tough to measure information, but not data. Bytes are countable. Bits, megabytes, terabytes, zettabytes, these things are countable. And there's an entry for data on firms' balance sheets. Now, these aren't perfect measures. Some data's irrelevant. Some is crummy and it's got lots of noise and lots of bytes. But, some buildings aren't very productive either, and they show up on balance sheets too. So we've got the same kinds of data sources, an ability to measure data as we do a lot of the hard assets in macroeconomics. And that's a big step forward. The second barrier, we haven't been able to integrate information frictions in many cases into standard dynamic recursive models. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to show you one way of doing that to overcome barrier 2. And 3 is, what important macro question cannot be answered without it? Let's stop with the dinky 2-period models and tackle some of the core questions in macroeconomics. So what is it that we really need information to understand? Data. You can't think meaningfully about data without understanding that at its heart, it's information. So that's what I want to tackle today. So it's kind of a strange exercise. I'm modeling data. Usually we bring data to models, not model to data. So why should we do this? Because macroeconomics should be able to weigh in about the information economy. It is an aggregate phenomena. It's not just I/O, it's not just micro, it's not just digital economics. It's an aggregate phenomena that's changing firms' values, and many of the largest firms in our economy are valued based primarily on this asset. Second, there are important policy questions arising. People are talking about wanting to regulate data, regulate privacy, regulate who can use what. Should we be able to gather this? Should we be able to share that? And how should we place tariffs on this data asset? Well, these are important questions, and we don't have frameworks right now. We're just letting them fly in the dark to try to figure out what are the right answers. And third, we should learn how to value data. Yeah, markets are putting valuations on firms, but they don't really know what they're doing. So let's think about how can we value this fundamentally with a framework, even if the price of the good they're selling is 0. Okay, so those are our objectives. What features do we need in a model to achieve them? First, data is a byproduct of economic activity. Second, firms with data make better forecasts. This is something that's used as a forecasting technology, like what machine learning and artificial intelligence are, and that makes them more productive. And third, data is a valuable asset. And so out of this model, we'll get a few results. First, the new economy is going to look a lot like the old economy in some important ways. Data will have diminishing returns, just like capital. And it can't sustain growth without technological progress. Not to say that it's not contributing to growth right now, but just like capital, we can grow through capital accumulation, but only up to a point. The same will be true of data. Second, I'll be able to show you data barter and why we might have zero-priced goods in exchange and still have a value for data. Third, cross-firm inequality will rise and then fall. And lastly, some firms will specialize in data production. Okay. So here's a model of data as a productive asset. Oops. Okay. So this is based on a working paper with Mariam Farboudi and is posted on our websites. There's a continuum of competitive firms I. Each firm produces KIT to the alpha units of goods with KIT units of capital. These goods have quality, AIT. Firms take equilibrium price as given, and their quality-adjusted outputs are perfect substitutes. Okay, so for the purpose of brevity, I'm just going to write down this is an inverse demand curve. The equilibrium price, PT, is a parameter, P bar. This is aggregate output to the negative gamma. So the more the economy produces, the lower is the price. What's aggregate output? It's the integral over all firms I of their quality-adjusted output, K to the alpha. So what's this quality thing? Quality is what data will help you improve. Quality depends on a production technique. This is something the firm is going to choose. This is little AIT. Data will help them make a better choice about that. The firm has an optimal technique, theta plus epsilon, but they don't know it. They're going to try to figure out what it is. Theta is the learnable part of that optimal technique. It's an AR1, and it's got an innovation, eta IT, which is normal, mean mu, variance, sigma theta squared. Epsilon AIT is normal 0 sigma A squared, it's unlearnable, and it's IID. Okay? So here's quality. Quality AIT is this parameter A hat. That's the maximum possible quality this firm could attain. Minus, that's their choice variable, that's their chosen production technique, and this is their optimal technique. So we're going to subtract from that maximum possible quality the distance, the squared distance, between the production technique they choose and what their optimum is. So what's data? Data is a byproduct of economic activity. Remember I said that was one of the desired features of our model. Here's that assumption. So data depends on T-1 production. The number of signals I get to see, that's NIT, this is a firm-specific parameter we'll call data mining ability, times KIT-1 to the alpha. So if I produced more stuff yesterday, then today I get to make use of all the data, all the information I got to learn about all the people that bought that stuff. Okay? So ZI is just there because at some point I want to think about firms that are really productive at using data or scraping data from their transactions, and some that are less productive. So this is the number of data points. What's a data point? Well, each data point, and I'll index a particular data point by m, so I've got n of these data points, so the index m runs from 1 to n. So each data point is a signal. It's a signal about theta, that learnable component of the optimal technique. So the signal, S for firm I, time t, and its signal m, because you've got many of these, each one is a data point, is theta, that thing you're trying to learn about, plus some signal noise. Signal noise is normal, mean 0, variance sigma epsilon squared. Okay? So getting more data means you get more of these signals, which teaches you more about theta. When you know more about theta, you get to choose a technique that's closer to theta. You get to shrink that distance, which means you subtract less from your maximum possible quality. So that's how data helps you improve quality by choosing a better technique. Okay? And lastly, there's a data adjustment cost. More on that in a second. So there's a state variable in this problem that I want to define before we go any further. And that state variable is the stock of knowledge. It's also a conditional precision of a firm's belief about theta. So let's unpack this, starting in the beginning, or in the middle. The expectation of theta, conditional on a firm's information set. That's a forecast. What do I think this random AR1 process will realize today? That's its actual realization. The difference between your forecast and the realization, that's a forecast error. So what's in the middle is a forecast error squared. So we have a squared forecast error, and then we take the expectation of that squared forecast error. An expected squared forecast error is the conditional variance of the forecast. How far away do you expect to be, your forecast do you expect to be from the truth, on average, in squared distance? And then we invert it. The inverse of a conditional variance is a conditional precision. Invert it because now larger is more data, it's more knowledge, it's just getting the direction right. So that's a useful state variable in part because we can now express expected quality, AIT, as A hat, that was your maximum possible quality, minus conditional variance, that's the, so here's AIT, there's the maximum. Omega inverse is the distance between A and theta squared, and then minus sigma A squared, which is the variance of this unlearnable component. You never get to bring A systematically closer to epsilon because you don't know anything about epsilon. So you can't choose an A that systematically gets any nearer or any further. Okay, so given those two expressions, we can now write the problem recursively. The optimal sequence of investment choices, KIT, solves the following recursive problem. The value of this stock of knowledge, omega IT, is you get to choose capital to maximize, price, that's expected quality, that's the same expression as what's up there, and that's your number of units of production. So that's your gross revenue, that first term. Minus, here's your knowledge, your data adjustment cost. It depends on the change in your stock of knowledge. There's your capital rental cost, and there's the discounted value of tomorrow's stock of knowledge. The data you'll get tomorrow depends on your data scraping ability and your production today, and here's the evolution for that state variable. And if you're familiar with a Kalman filter, this will look familiar as the variance, the inverse of the variance equation of a Kalman filter. So tomorrow's stock of knowledge has two parts. I'm going to start with the second. This is the number of new data points you'll see tomorrow. That's the precision of each data point. So number of data points times the precision, that's the total amount of new information you get to see tomorrow because you produced stuff today. This is the old information. This is the stuff you had at time t that you're going to bring into tomorrow. But when you take the time t information, the time t knowledge, and bring it to tomorrow, you have to discount it. Why do you discount knowledge? You discount knowledge because yesterday's data was about yesterday's theta. Theta is an AR1 process. It's constantly changing. So signals about yesterday's value are somewhat relevant for today's value, but they're not as relevant as signals about today's data. And if you had data from 10 periods ago, that wouldn't be very relevant at all because in the meantime, theta's changed 9 times. So you got to discount old data because these are signals about a moving target. And the more it's moved, the less relevant those signals are. So how do you discount this data? Okay, so here's your stock of knowledge yesterday. In addition, you got one other piece of information, which is you're going to get to see how good your goods were, what your actual quality was, and that's going to reveal to you a little bit more about what yesterday's theta was. That's that information. So together, these two things are what you had, all the knowledge you had at the end of period t. You discount by the persistence of the AR1 process. If that AR1 process is very persistent, then something about yesterday's value is very relevant for today. If that process has very little persistence in it, then you got to discount old information a lot because theta's moving around a lot. And you discount by the variance of the innovation in the AR1 process. If the AR1 process has big innovations, then yesterday's information is also less relevant. So that's the discounting of old data. Okay, so a firm's stock of knowledge then is a discounted sum of all the data that they've seen throughout their history, just like a stock of capital is a discounted sum of investments. dV d omega is the marginal value of one additional piece of data of precision 1, or the marginal value of an additional unit of precision. That is how the firm should price its data. It's its willingness to pay. It's willing to pay that for a marginal unit of data. The price of goods here can also be 0. We can have a situation with data barter. Why? If the price is 0, that term's 0, that term's 0, that's negative. If we invest any capital, we've got to pay. Why would I be willing to pay to invest if I'm getting 0 revenue? Because if I produce today with KIT units of capital, I get NIT plus 1 units of data, and I increase that term. So I might be willing to produce at 0 price because producing at 0 price gets me more data tomorrow. So you can think of that as a form of costly investment in future quality. Okay. So many of you in this room have probably taught the Solow growth model at some point. And you've probably seen a graph that looks just like this. And the red line was the depreciation of the capital, and the blue line was the inflows into the capital stock from savings. Well, we've got the same thing, except for data accumulation. What are the inflows? That's the number of new data points you saw, and that's the precision of each of the data points. Those are our inflows. That's what's plotted here in blue. The more data stock you have, the more productive you are, the more you decide to invest and produce, and the more data points you produce going forward. But there's also data depreciation, as I just explained to you. Because data is a moving process, old data is worth less, we got to depreciate it. That's not actually linear, that equation I showed you, obviously, but when you plot it out, it looks pretty close. So what happens? When you're down here, you got more inflows than outflows, and you grow. So your data stock grows, you still got more inflows and outflows, you grow, you grow, you grow, you grow, until those two cross, and then you stop growing. This looks just like Solow's model with capital accumulation. Key feature, that is concave. If it weren't, you wouldn't have that steady state, and you could sustain infinite growth. So why is it concave? Okay, two reasons. One is we've got k to the alpha. Alpha's typically less than 1. But even if alpha were 1, that would still be concave. Why? Because what data is doing is it's allowing you to shrink this distance. But you can only ever shrink that distance to 0. Data is for prediction. Predictions can only have 0 forecast error. You can't go any lower than that. So there's a bound to its benefit. Now you can also look at that and say, okay, she kind of hardwired it, right? Because I've got this maximum possible quality, and then imperfect information subtracts off from that. So it's kind of mechanical. Sure, but let me tell you about what the alternative to that looks like. If you don't want to buy that that blue curve is concave, essentially what you're saying is infinite data will get me certainty about tomorrow's state. So 1 period ahead, perfect foresight, means infinite production. We have a lot of perfect foresight models in macro. I have yet to come across one that had infinite production because of its perfect foresight. If you want to think that data can sustain growth, you have to be willing to equate perfect foresight with not high profit for one firm that beats its rivals, not a lot of production, but infinite production at the aggregate level. That sounds to me like alchemy. Okay, so here's how data stock for a firm can grow over time. It can start growing really slowly. Why? Well, because we've got these data adjustment costs, and they're not in our inflows and outflows, but they can make that transition from near 0 down here to get out of that low region really slow. That's why we put them in there. So a firm might start growing really slowly, but as it starts to grow, data helps it be more productive, which causes it to choose a higher capital investment, which generates more output, and more output generates more data. So we've got this data feedback loop that's also helping it to grow faster. But eventually, that forecast error is approaching 0. And when you got a lot of data, that forecast error is really close to 0, and it just gets a little bit closer and a little bit closer, and the benefits start to level off. So that's what the path for one firm looks like. Suppose we've got 3 firms, and they start with different initial data stocks. So this is hard to see here, but blue is a little bit higher than red, which is a little bit higher than yellow, but they're really arbitrarily close together. What happens? Well, because the blue firm had a little bit more data initially, it takes off first, then the red, then the yellow. And what's happening here is they start really close together when they're all pretty crummy at data processing. There's a lot of divergence in the middle, but then eventually they come together, right? So it's the diminishing returns to data, the fact that you can only send forecast errors to 0, and that gets you a finite benefit, that suggests that if we think that the divergence in firm size and firm productivity is due just to data accumulation, not to anti-competitive behavior, not to any of a myriad of other things that firms may be doing that's nefarious with their data, but just due to data accumulation makes a firm bigger, helps it to accumulate more data. If that alone is going on, that eventually should give rise to convergence. So it suggests that perhaps if this is the dynamic that's driving divergence in firm size, it might be temporary. Okay, so one of the features I wanted a model to have was to have data as an asset that's tradable. So let's put tradable data in the model. Okay, so I'm going to think about a very simple example. My time is finite. I'm going to think about one firm trading data and the rest of the market that's held constant. I'm going to think of exclusive use, meaning if one firm is using the data, other firms can't. And I'll talk at the end about how to relax that. And I'll use a quadratic adjustment cost. So I'm going to think about a firm that uses precision, little omega. And it's got a price pi. So what I mean by using precision? Well, if the used precision is less than n was the number of data points they produced. If they're using less than they produced, it means they're selling data. If they're using more than what they produced, they're buying data. So now let's rewrite our recursive problem. The value of data, omega it, is the maximum over, now you choose capital, but you also choose data usage. We've got price, expected quality, the units produced, that's all the same as before, and here's our new term, pi, nit plus 1, minus your usage. So if you produce more than you use, that term will be positive, and you'll get some revenue from selling your data. But if you use more than what you produced, this term is negative, and you're going to have to pay because you're buying data. Minus the data adjustment cost, capital rental rate, discounted value tomorrow. The evolution of the stock of knowledge, we've got the same discounted knowledge from yesterday, but instead of adding all the data you've produced, you add the data you've used. If I didn't have any data adjustment cost, if psi were equal to 0, I'd get immediate convergence here, just like you would in a capital accumulation model where there were no adjustment frictions to capital. If you could rent capital frictionlessly, you would immediately rent the optimal amount. Okay, so I'm going to think about two cases. One where there's a firm that's not a very productive data miner. So this firm has a ZI of 1, so it produces 1 unit, it gets 1 unit of data, in an economy where the rest of the firms have a ZI of 10. So what does that firm do? It sells and then buys data and builds up its stock of knowledge. Why does it sell early? Because of the capital adjustment cost. Early on, this is a firm that's like got one of these old-fashioned cash registers. It keeps books with pencil and eraser, and it has no systems to use data. So it doesn't buy any data. In fact, it's perfectly willing to sell its data to somebody else who can use it. But they start incurring the capital adjustment costs. They get their first computer system. They're able to use data, and then they start buying. And they accumulate, and all this time, they're becoming more productive. Contrast this with a case of a, giving away the punchline. Contrast this with a very productive data miner who's going to sell most of their data. Okay, so this firm has a ZI of 15, so they immediately sell almost all the data they produce. Notice their stock of knowledge is even lower than the unproductive firm, so they retain almost none of this data. So why don't data miners use much of their own data? The reason is they don't need high-quality goods. That's not where their revenue is coming from. This firm's getting revenue from selling its data. So it doesn't care if the goods it produces are like that crummy app on your phone. As long as they're getting data, they're getting money. Yikes, this thing's sensitive. Okay, so lastly, I want to address a question that comes up sometimes. Maybe this data is not really used for productivity. It's not all that socially valuable. This is all just used for advertising and business stealing. Does this overturn our results? Well, suppose data processing helps the firm that uses it, but it has no social value. So here I'm going to choose, I'm going to lift a trick from the playbook of Morris and Shin and say that productivity, or quality, is total quality minus that same term as before. Now I'm going to integrate over all other firms, j equals 0 to 1, and I'm going to subtract off their forecasting mistakes of aggregate quality. So what does this do? Well, if I integrate this up, the aggregate AIT, integrated over all firms I, will get minus integral over all I, plus integral over all j. These two terms will cancel, and I'm going to get a constant aggregate quality. So no social benefit to data at all. Yet, same results, meaning the figures I showed you before, they won't change. Same logic still holds. Why? Because this term doesn't affect the firm's first order condition. It's going to make the same choices. It's going to accumulate data in the same way, price data in the same way, have the same firm dynamics, same divergence, same convergence. All it affects is aggregate quality and welfare. Okay, this is just a sketch. There are a ton of ways to improve what I did. It's wrong along so many dimensions, but hopefully it's a start. Here are some things we could add. I'm sure you can think of more. I didn't really have non-rival data. That's an important feature. But in order to incorporate that, we really need imperfect competition. If we've got perfect competition, there's no reason a firm doesn't want to sell all its data to everybody. We want data markets with reasonable prices. High demand data might have a lower price. Everybody wants it. That's like the New York Times. But specialized data could be really expensive. And data providers might choose what to provide. And those kinds of features could give us realistic business cycle variance and covariance. The choice of what data to purchase or process, we might think about theta as being a vector, not just one number, and then you choose which kind of data, which theta, which one of those entries you want to learn about. That's what rational inattention is really all about. We might have agents who use data to learn about the distribution of shocks. That's like what I've done with Venki and Julian. And that could get us persistent responses to unusual events. Could add firm entry and exit, market power, lots of things. So data is a really important asset, and it's becoming more so. It's kind of like capital in many ways. It's got some features of technology. It's non-rival. It raises productivity. But the key difference is, as the forecast errors get smaller, most information has decreasing returns. And fundamentally, AI and machine learning are prediction technologies. Perfect predictions don't make for infinite output. So data may be changing allocations of rents in the economy, but it's not changing its fundamental economics. But there are a lot of open questions that we can still ask, both theoretically and empirically. How much of the superstar firm phenomenon is due to data economics? Has it changed the returns to capital and labor? How do we value firms whose main assets are data? This gives you a framework to start thinking about some of those questions. So I hope you'll join me and make data great again. Big data is so sad. With me, you'll get huge data. And together, we'll make data great again.
Is this working? Okay, so we're going to open it up to the floor for some questions. There's people going around the room, so well.
Thanks for your talk. It's really interesting.
Thank you.
I was wondering, can we also think of data as increasing the productivity of R&D instead of just increasing productivity?
Yeah.
So it seems like that could lead to different conclusions about the long-run effects of data. And given that some R&D intensive professions like economics are very data intensive, I'm curious, what are your thoughts about that perspective?
Absolutely. I think that's a key question, and I'm not ruling that out. My claim was that without productivity improvements, without R&D, without new technology, data alone won't sustain growth. But I think the question for could data accelerate growth that's because it's complementing idea production is a very interesting question and is certainly possible. Okay.
I was going to ask two questions. One, how would it change if you had competition and say you had Bertrand pricing instead of Cournot competition? If that would change the incentives to accumulate data and whether there would be inefficiency to data accumulation. And the other question was going back to the beginning of your presentation when you were mentioning about exports and perhaps data coming from multinational firms. I mean, whether countries should, I don't know, impose tariffs or block, the flow of data.
Okay, so the answer to the first question is, I don't know. That sounds like a good research question. Somebody should work it out. I hope I inspire somebody to do that. I think data doesn't have the same inefficiencies as what we saw for technology, right? For technology, it was clear we needed rents because of its leakage and because of the costly nature of technology production. And those two things are different for data. So it's possible that the answers are very different. That's as much as I know. Is this, efficient? Is it efficient under different competition rules? Good question. For what should the tariff be? I don't know what framework to think of in which I want to have tariffs. Usually I don't. But let's say that we want to extract surplus from tariffs for some reason. This is a valuable asset that's crossing borders, and just because it didn't have a price associated with it doesn't mean there's not value there. So it's not in a world where you want to have tariffs, it's not crazy to think that one might want to place this sum on this as well, but I'd need a whole framework of what constitutes an optimal tariff in order to answer your question.
So there was something hardwired in your setting that more data lowers the forecast error. But one could think that more data also lets you learn about many other things. So
Right.
it is given a technology, given something you want to learn, I understand that more data could lower the forecast error and you get this diminishing returns. But if you start learning about more technologies as we get more data, that can easily put an increasing return on.
Okay, so I think part of this is there's a vocabulary issue. What do we call data and what do we call idea production? I do think that machine learning, artificial intelligence are prediction algorithms. They're not idea invention algorithms. So this is about prediction and doing better prediction. Could data be used for other things? Sure, right? Data's used, we can encode music as a binary sequence, and that can be data, right? There are lots of other things that are data. I'm really talking about data as it's used by these algorithms.
Better predictions can make you discard bad technologies and adopt better technologies, right?
Okay, absolutely. So then that's similar to the question that came before, which is, could data be a complement to idea production? Absolutely. I don't mean, yes, that's a possibility. Is that true? Let's go figure it out. But that's, if we want to think about data and its ability to perpetuate growth or facilitate growth, that's the key question.
First of all, thanks for a great lecture.
Thank you.
You have this identity between data and barter, which I think is very interesting. But something bothers me a little, because in barter, you barter X and something, and you know exactly what you're bartering. I'm giving services, but I never know exactly what I'm giving. That's sort of bothersome.
There usually are some terms and conditions that one could read that would let you know that. But I agree that this is a particular kind of barter, and maybe we're also not aware. And by the way, I think that's part of why they do it as a barter, right? Because you could imagine, I'll pay you, $5 for the app, and you'll pay me, $4 for my data, and we'd price each of those and do them separately. I think the reason they bundle them is because it makes you less aware of what you're giving up and what its value might be. So I agree, it's not exactly like all the barters we've seen before, but it is exchanging two things without using a price mechanism.
Back here.
Who's back there?
Can you hear me? Yes.
I can hear you, I can't see you though.
So in your model, data is sort of universally positive. More signals you get, the better you produce and the more you learn. But based on the picture behind you, we also know there's another side of signals or data, the bad stuff. So using data to foil someone else's plans. I don't know no idea how to put this in a framework that's logical, but have you thought about that and how sort of negative data use could be built into this and give a different kind of prediction?
Right. So this framework where we thought about data as business stealing, that had data, oops. Here, data is not socially positive, it's socially neutral. If you want to make it socially negative, put a coefficient there that's greater than 1. And you can make data reduce welfare, but still firms will want to accumulate it because individually they benefit, but society as a whole would be worse off. That would make data like a prisoner's dilemma, basically. So you could do it. There could be subsets of data where that's the right model. Again, I'm not talking about all data, everything on social media. So, I'm really thinking about using data for prediction. But if you think there are nefarious predictions out there that are eating away at the social value or the social fabric in ways that hurt utility, put a coefficient greater than 1 on the last term, and you've got your model. What else? One more, okay.
Okay, so I have 2 questions.
Okay.
So my first question is like, when you have constant returns to scale, the firm size distribution is undetermined. But now you have this data thing, then it seems that you actually want a lot of firms. So because every firm producing epsilon output will get you a new piece of data. So having just one firm will not be optimal anymore. With having a lot of very small firms with constant returns to scale will produce a lot of data. So that's one question. The second question, this analogy with the growth literature that you have in growth, the scale effects. So it seems to me that you will get also some sort of scale effects when you think about that analogy. And then maybe that bigger countries will grow faster or will have a bigger GDP. So I don't know, there is some impression that there will be scale effects there also with this data analogy and growth. I don't know.
Okay. Okay, so let me start with the first question. I think in this model, it's best to have one big firm do all the production and all the data generation. But the reason is because I'm not letting data be truly non-rival. So that one firm that does a ton of production and gets a ton of data will therefore produce very high quality goods because they get to use all of the data in the economy. And that'll generate a lot of output. That's not a desire, that ruling out non-rivalry, it's not something I wanted. I just was trying to keep it very simple. And in order to have data be a non-rival good, I've got to have some reason that people wouldn't share it with everyone, which means something you do has to have price impact. So I've got to move away from perfect competition. So technically speaking, in my model, I want one big firm, but that's not a feature, that's building on a feature of it that I don't find so desirable. I do think that there are returns to scale where there are big firms that generate lots of data and they're going to be more productive, and that logic may well apply to countries. And the idea, in that S-curve, could a firm actually get stuck in like a data poverty trap? Well, if I put in a little bit of fixed cost somewhere, it might, in the sense that it might not enter because it's so data poor that it's going to get stuck in this really low quality trap for such a long time that it wouldn't want to pay a cost to enter. And that might that might look like what some countries are going through. I don't know. I can see the analogy that you're drawing. Whether that's true or not, let's go find out.